Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this breakout session, which is looking at the global competition for capital in the low-carbon space and examining how well-placed Scotland, and indeed the UK as a whole, but Scotland in particular, is placed to benefit in that competition, what it can do to attract capital into the country and would make itself more attractive as a home for investment. The effective deployment of capital in the low-carbon space remains one of the biggest challenges to the successful rollout of the sector. The marketplace for capital, both debt and equity, has become increasingly competitive, and getting the right sorts of capital to the right sorts of project is increasingly difficult. Since the conference met last year, one could argue that the UK and Scotland in particular have had a number of successes in attracting capital investment into projects and companies within the region. But on the other hand, we could look to other successes in other jurisdictions which have perhaps stolen a march on us in terms of carbon capture and storage, solar projects and offshore wind in particular. So it'll be interesting to examine some of those questions and see what more we can be doing to make ourselves attractive as a nation in terms of attracting investment. We've got a very interesting panel for you this morning with a wide range of perspectives, and I'll just take a moment to introduce each of those. First of all, we have Andy MacDonald from Scottish Enterprise. Andy's a Senior Director at Scottish Enterprise with responsibility for renewable energy and low-carbon technologies. Next, we have Ron Haysdar from Masdar, who's Head of Project Development there, followed by Charles Abel-Smith of UKGI for the time being. And Ronnie Quinn of the Crown Estates. Ronnie is the Scottish lead for the Crown Estates on energy and infrastructure. And then Richard Simon Lewis, who's a Senior Director at Lloyds Banking Group with responsibility for renewable energy. What we're planning to do is to hear from each of the speakers with their perspectives on the topic for today, and then we'll hand over to you in the audience to ask questions that you have and move forward the debate. On your chairs, you'll find a survey which we've been carrying on in conjunction with the organisers of the conference, just looking at people's attitude to investment globally in low carbon and getting people's individual perspectives on that. We've had a very good online response to the survey, but we wanted to get responses here today as well. And if during the course of today's session you're able to fill in that form and leave it on your seats, we'll take that and feed it into the results. We're then planning to circle back with our panel on the results of that and then issue a little thought piece on that to all of the attendees at the conference. So if you have some time to fill in that survey, that would be super. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Andy to give us his thoughts on the matter.
Okay, thanks very much, Ewan, and good morning, everyone. My brief for today was to talk a little bit about what we as the Economic Development Agency are doing to try and help create and build the environment for attracting investment into the renewables sector in Scotland, the low-carbon sector. And I think I need to be slightly wary that I don't just repeat what you heard from Lena Wilson earlier and then from the First Minister. But in essence, our position is that we're very much trying to build the climate for investment, so making sure that the infrastructure is in place and is being developed in order that that will attract investors, setting Scotland apart from other competitive areas which are also seeking similar investment. Working very hard to develop a very strong base of companies here. Again, in some respects, making some of those companies investor ready, and we've seen some of the information that was published yesterday regarding the work of my colleagues in the Scottish Investment Bank, working with companies in that respect, trying to ensure that we have the companies here who are innovative, investing in development, making sure that the technology challenges and the investment challenges that we face in trying to attract, for example, offshore renewable wind, around the cost reduction aspects of that the infrastructure is here, the companies are here, that the investment climate is created where we are doing things that are attractive, we're doing things that make this the place people want to come to engage, building the academic infrastructure around that and building the industrial infrastructure around that. So we have the infrastructure for people to come here. We have the companies, both multinational and indigenous companies, who are innovative in their thinking and are being supported to be creative and engage in this new opportunity. We are investing in the investment in the innovation structures and innovation culture here. We did an evaluation of the whole innovation system in Scotland very early in the development of the government's offshore route map. And one of the things that we were looking at there was to be clear where the most added value in bringing together the structures in academia and industry together. For example, in the Scottish Energy Laboratory project, which is about signposting where best practice lies and bringing good practice forward and investing further in it. So you have the space for the companies, you have the innovative companies, you have the strong innovative infrastructure around that, things like the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult Centre and another part of that investment. And then finally, that with events like today's and the sort of discussions we're having here, once you've created that environment, how do you get the investment? Where is the investment going to come from? How do we continue to tune what we're doing here in Scotland to ensure that the market that we want to target is going to be interested in the product that we offer? On the international stage with our colleagues in Scottish Development International, on the domestic stage with the development of the infrastructure, development of companies, making sure that we have all the pieces in place where we can and need to influence the development of policy. And again, the statements this morning you'll have heard about the need to make sure that the demands and needs of some of the companies currently looking to invest in significant levels in Scotland and in the UK are a match with government policy, that they're encouraged to do so. These things are hugely critical to over all of us, but they're hugely critical to pulling together a climate where investment will then be attracted, and our job then is to continue to deliver and develop that. So really what we're looking at is trying to build the climate to make Scotland investable and make Scotland's projects investable. That's kind of our key function, I would say, at this moment in time, at an early stage in a developing sector with lots of new opportunities, and trying to bring focus to where the greatest value lies in an economic sense.
Thanks, Andy. I think it's useful to reflect that when it comes to infrastructure, we've got to think about skills and academic infrastructure and best practices as well as industrial infrastructure, and prevent there being any skills gap.
You're absolutely right, and I think one of the great things now is we're having done a lot of work in developing the company base, seeing the start of investment. It's a phenomenal pipeline of potential investment over the next few years in Scotland. And industry, public agencies such as ourselves, but particularly the likes of the Scottish Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland, are really now starting to address how we provide the skills for that development in future. A lot of the companies have been doing this stuff for a long time. What we're trying to do is work with them to bring out the real demand, the real timelines, the real needs, and then to take that message back down the way. I mean, everybody at school age needs to understand the potential to have a career, a lifetime career potentially, as we've seen in oil and gas, that in a developing industry that is international, that could take them around the world in a host of exciting new technologies. But we need to present that as an opportunity and then make sure the resources are available to bring people in and train them with the appropriate skill sets.
Thank you. Ron, over to you.
Yeah, I actually said most of it this morning, so I can't repeat it again, but I think it would be a bit boring, because I don't have the pictures I had this morning. So, you know, for Masdar, as basically a owner-operator based out of the Middle East, what we're looking for, and like I said this morning, is, you know, stability. Because the last thing we want is obviously invest and have a regime, renewable obligations regime, for instance, what's now happening in the UK, being changed. Which we, if you look at London Array, you know, it's, I believe this is a very good investment because it has a ROC, it has a stable income. Yeah, you take merchant risk, but fine. And that's now all suddenly not so clear anymore. And so we're scratching our head where this is actually going. We have investment in Spain. Not to go into detail about Spain, but you know that creates a bit of a concern for all of us in Abu Dhabi. Is like, so where is this actually heading? And hence that in what the presentation they did this morning, maybe was a bit hidden, but was that it's very easy to to invest in a renewable energy project, but if that requires a massive amount of subsidy from a government, from anything, you know that in the long term. And that's what I call this morning, you know, a short-term solution for a long-term problem. Is not really what helps, because at the end of the day, the minute there is a downturn, what you will find is that the first thing happens is that you will cut the subsidy. You know, we had a discussion in Spain where the minister said, hospitals, renewable energy. That's the bill he had to do. So that's where you then need to be very careful. So back to Scotland. That's why we're quite keen to understand, you know, where that is going. And the minister didn't refer to his urge for independency, but you know, this is like, so what does that mean? How does it affect? You know, future investments? Because it goes back to the stability element again. The other thing where we find this again on London Array is the supply chain, where we find that for London Array, for instance, quite a majority, well actually far out the majority of that investment comes, or in the supply chain doesn't come out of the UK. It comes out of my home country, the Netherlands. It comes out of Denmark. So back what you said earlier is like how does the support industry works in, like for instance in Scotland, is that specifically because London Array, it's close to continental Europe, so you can get stuff basically shipped straight out of Europe without too much of a logistic nightmare. Scotland, it's slightly further away, so that creates an issue as well. So this is where the supply chain and how does the support function in that particular project in the investments you want to make actually works. So that's where we as an investor would very specifically look at from a distance. And then, like I said, for us, stability is key to understand that your billions of dollars of investment actually comes up with a return, which makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. You mentioned the independence word, and I think we might come back to that in the questions because there's some further issues to discuss around that, which would be good to talk about. And also the supply chain issue, I think, is an important one. There has to be a deliverable mechanic for implementing these projects, and the investors need to know that's there and capable of being used. But of course, a supply chain won't materialise unless there's a good supply of projects to build out, as we all know. So some interesting issues in that. Charles, over to you.
Okay, well, just before I kick off, just to sort of clarify any confusion that might exist in people's minds as to the difference between UK Green Investments and the Green Investment Bank. As many of you will know, the UK government can't set up a state-owned bank until it's got state aid approval from Brussels. So UK Green Investments was set up by the Department of Business last year as a sort of precursor to the Green Investment Bank to start the investment process before state aid approval comes through. We're hoping to get white smoke from Brussels in the not too distant future, and so whilst our state aid sort of legal colleagues within BIS would not want me to create any connection, then the connection between the UKGI and the Green Investment Bank is a matter of pure coincidence. You won't be too surprised if one looks like the other fairly closely when it starts. But I just thought I'd look at two perspectives. I mean, one is to give you a flavour of how we think the Green Investment Bank will need to operate. And then secondly, some specific thoughts on sort of how Scotland can attract low carbon investment. And I guess particularly from my own personal perspective, my brief within UK Green Investments is to develop the business stream within non-domestic energy efficiency. So I guess the first sort of thing about the Green Investment Bank is there are two key parts to its mission. The first is to accelerate the UK's transition to a green economy by leveraging in private capital. But the second part of it is to create an enduring institution operating at arm's length of government. Our shareholder, the government, has helpfully given us some key pointers as to where it wants us to focus our attention, and the First Minister mentioned those this morning, so offshore wind, non-domestic energy efficiency, energy efficiency more broadly, and waste. So those are the priority sectors that we've been given to focus on. And we've been allocated £3 billion of capital, which government wants to see invested over the next 2.5 years now. Now that's £3 billion of capital against sort of hundreds of billions of pounds of potential funding requirement across our sectors. So we're going to have to be quite innovative about how we make the impact that government wants us to make. We won't have the balance sheet to operate like a KfW or an EIB. Recycling our capital is going to have to be a fundamental part of our sort of DNA and our sort of operating principles. We're going to have three key investment criteria. The first is sound banking. We're going to have to generate a reasonable return for the risks that we take. That's fundamental to creating an enduring institution. We see the £3 billion capital as an endowment. If we're going to contribute to the mission, we've got to make sure we grow that endowment and do that by investing on sort of on sound commercial principles. The second investment criterion is additionality. So our role is about crowding capital in, not crowding capital out. And in practice, the only way that we're going to be able to achieve that, and also to achieve the sort of sound banking, enduring institution perspective, is by working I guess, at the leading edge of our markets with the pioneer investors, the sort of wagon train that Susan Rice referred to this morning, but trying to identify those pioneer investors who are willing and interested in investing with us. And by investing wisely with them and making good returns, and then demonstrating to the market that actually you can make good returns in these markets. And if we can do that, actually private sector capital will follow, and our role will no longer be required in those markets. We will then need to move on to the next generation of priority sectors. If we fail to do that, we make poor investments, we lose money, or we make poor returns, actually we'll have a profoundly negative impact on mobilisation, because we'll simply confirm the sceptics right. And then the third investment criterion is green. But we see green as a sort of pass-fail test that defines our universe of investable opportunity. And I guess the key to our success is that we work and identify those areas where you can generate good returns out of green projects. Based upon the policy interventions that government wants to put in place in order to make these sectors investable. Clearly, accelerating green investment by focusing our efforts on markets where you can sustain the investment by attracting private capital to see that growth. So those are the sort of, I guess, the three operating principles and the principles to which we're going to have to operate as the Green Investment Bank. Then thinking about sort of more specifically Scotland, and from my own perspective with non-domestic energy efficiency, you start from the principle investment needs good project opportunities, and the biggest challenge I've got in my market, in contrast to my colleagues in offshore wind and waste, is actually at the moment the market is not yet generating a significant pipeline of investable projects. I think we can all cite a broad range of conceptual energy efficiency projects that we'd like to see take place. We know the technical solutions. But the challenge is how do you convert those conceptual projects into investable projects which we can then finance. We certainly see a significant role for the public sector here. The public sector has a number of parts that it can play, I think we certainly see within Scotland there's a great opportunity for Scotland to show how this can be done, and we're actively engaged with a number of different parties within Scotland on how to sort of create the architecture to generate that deal flow, and very much welcome the First Minister's announcement this morning on the advisory group as an initiative of how do we make all this happen. So I guess the message from us is that UKGI and the Green Investment Bank is absolutely up for making it work. We're excited, I guess, by the opportunity of being headquartered in Scotland, the enthusiasm and the drive within Scotland to actually see if we can make Scotland a place that can demonstrate and show the rest of the UK and the rest of the world how to make these difficult to create projects happen and get invested in.
Thank you. Charles, there's a very interesting point, I think, there, and it's a kind of a salutary tale, really, about making sure that we have good quality projects, and the market needs to be proactive to attract investment in, but by creating projects that are well structured and well thought through, you can attract capital into the jurisdiction. That's an important point.
And I think one of the challenges we've got is the Green Investment Bank, that it's an organisation that's being set up to deploy capital. So as the GIB, it's going to have to be careful about not getting too sort of bogged down into project delivery or programme development, but we do see ourselves as having an important catalytic role. And so the secret of our success is going to be trying to get others to do the heavy lifting, but with the sort of encouragement that if we can develop the projects, our role is absolutely to make sure that those projects can be financed in an efficient financing market.
Thank you. And Ronnie, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to have a quick word about the prize that we've got on offer at present, both in offshore renewables and the energy that's going to come from that, and also in the supply chain, because I think that's how we maximise the benefit to Scotland in particular. For those of you who don't know, the Crown Estate runs and administers the leasing rounds for the offshore renewables sector. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the role of the Crown Estate. If you want to learn more about it, please come to the stand downstairs, and we'll be more than happy to talk about that. But if I could just set the scene of what's out there at present. So far as offshore wind's concerned, in Scotland alone, the extended pipeline is already at 10 gigawatts. The important thing of that is 2.9, or almost 2.9 of that, is is in planning at present with Marine Scotland today, now. So that's almost a third. More importantly, that's on time and on schedule. So, and that includes the first of the big round 3 sites, Zone 1 up in the Moray Firth. Crown Estate are investing directly up to about £100 million or over £100 million in round 3 alone. But we do recognise that even getting that 2.9 gigawatts into consenting just now, that represents a significant spend on the part of the developers that are already out there, running into many tens of millions of pounds already being spent. As far as the supply chain is concerned, Scottish Renewables did an excellent piece of work earlier on this year, I think about January, February, where they worked out that there was already about 11,000 jobs in renewables in Scotland. And with what's happening, I think that number can only increase going forward. There will be an opportunity for Scotland, and we're working with Andy and his colleagues at Scottish Enterprise, with Highlands and Islands Enterprise, with the Scottish Government and with Marine Scotland, to see how we can go about maximising Scotland's role in manufacturing, in construction, and the Cinderella of all this, and it tends to be forgotten about, is operations and maintenance. Because that's, as people have been saying, that's a job for life. These projects have 20, 25-year terms, and operations and maintenance has to be maintained for that period of time. How much Scotland wants of that will largely determine what Scotland gets out of that. We need to be ambitious, and I think we need to set our goals high and see how much of that opportunity we can attract. The goal for Scottish companies is huge. We've got that pipeline on our doorstep, but we've also got the UK market, and that includes Northern Ireland. And I'm just checking my watch, half an hour ago, the Northern Ireland leasing round was announced for offshore renewables. So the UK market is the biggest in the world for offshore, and that's on our doorstep. I think we lose a lot of opportunities if we're too parochial here. We're part of a UK market, and we should be looking to work within that UK market. And if we lift the eyes a little bit further, Northern Europe is certainly a potential export site as well. So that's where the markets are. Do we have to wait on the Scottish projects coming forward to construction? No, we don't. There are already projects out there just now that Scottish companies are deriving benefit from and are winning tenders for. And I think it's important that we get the message down to the industrial base of Scotland and let them know that that market's there. Don't wait on the market coming for construction in Scotland in a couple of years' time. Get in there just now. There are plenty of opportunities in the UK and in Northern Europe. Thanks.
Thanks, Ronnie. I mean, you quite rightly point out how much money has already been spent to get the projects that are currently in planning into that stage, and it's great that that's all happened to time and schedule so far. It's been really good news. I suppose though, when you look at the 10 gigawatts that could be built, the amount of capital required to construct those projects, and also the amount of capital that might be required to support the supply chain to actually allow the implementation is massive.
Absolutely, and I think that's why we have to broaden the horizons and look not just at what's here and now off the shores of Scotland, but let's be ambitious and let's see what we can tap into in the rest of the UK and indeed the rest of Northern Europe.
Absolutely, absolutely. Richard.
Ewan, thanks very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think from a sort of funder's standpoint, and specifically in relation to funding energy infrastructure on a sort of project finance basis, I mean, what I'd like to do is maybe try to sort of weave in to our perception of where Scotland is and where the market is generally, some of the, the messages that have come out from my sort of fellow panelists. And I think there are a couple of things. I think regulation is absolutely at a pivotal point in relation to, whether the UK progresses as a market at the forefront of renewable energy technology, specifically offshore wind, or whether we tie ourselves up in knots. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have been involved in funding energy infrastructure projects through two very significant, realignments of the market. The first one was vesting back in 1990, when we saw, the sort of new build thermal capacity coming through the UK. Then we had the new electricity trading arrangements in 2001, 2002, which was fairly catastrophic for the banks in terms of the exits of some large players post the adjustment to that market. And now clearly we are in a transition period as we move from the RO into energy market reform in 2017. And I think from the perspective of a funder in this market now, and clearly Susan outlined that, the bank has made commitments of over 3 billion to renewables, 50 projects. We're a lead bank on all the deals that we're involved in, including Links that we closed this year, which took 2 years to close, 1.3 billion of capex, and the bank had 6 roles in that deal. So we are a big bank in offshore. We're the most active bank in onshore. We're ranked number 1 by Bloomberg year to date and last year. So big commitment from the bank side. But I think regulation is, absolutely at the centre of what's driving this market. And I think if you're trying to fund and close deals at the moment, I think there is a sense of concern about the decisions that people are making around investment as we transition towards EMR. And I think, where that manifests itself most specifically is around the nuts and bolts of getting these deals to market, around contracts such as power purchase agreements. And I think the way I look at a power purchase agreement, it's akin to a canary in the coal mine, okay? The canary in the coal mine is basically, sensing the buildup of toxic gases, okay? And the canary is basically saying, look, guys, this isn't great. We need to do something about it. And what we're seeing in the provision of PPAs in this market, which provide route to market and stability in relation to the economics of these renewable deals, is a withdrawal of both the breadth and the type of support that you get through these key contracts. Now, that is absolutely happening now. Okay, I've been doing this for 20 odd years. I've seen more of an evolution in the structure of PPAs over the last 18 months than I've seen in 20 years, because the providers of the PPAs have a lack of clarity around what this market is going to look like in 10, 15 years' time. Is it a market that's weighted towards nuclear? Is it a market that has a greater weighting towards intermittency? Is there more gas on the system? Are we making choices between gas and renewables, rather than choices in which gas and renewables are complementary partners on the system? So, turning to Scotland, my sense is that you could not have a more supportive and unequivocal and public leadership team politically in the First Minister and the Energy Minister, galvanising inward investment towards this market. But frankly, unless the regulatory framework is right, and it works for inward investment, and it works for long-term funding, then frankly, it's an exercise in futility. So I think we are at a critical point. EMR has to work. It's an incredibly complex set of mechanisms. But, if we are lending 10-year money, 15-year money, we're involved in offshore, we're involved in onshore, we have massive commitment to this market. Unless the regulation's right, the money will not flow.
Spot on, I agree. I've never heard a PPA compared to a canary before, but I like the analogy. I think it works well. Just leaving EMR to one side for a moment, I'd be interested in the panel's views generally on this. Do people think that the taking the ROC rebanding as a litmus test, is there a sufficiently different approach between Scottish Government and Westminster Government to say that the regulatory regime is more certain in Scotland than it is in England and Wales?
I mean, I would tend to say that there's maybe a greater weighting in the encouragement provided to renewables in Scotland than notionally in the balance of the UK. I mean, I think clearly there are very public discussions taking place within government around choices in relation to gas, renewables. I mean, it's slightly sort of Jekyll and Hyde, in relation to which way do we go. But I think Scotland appears to be firmly rooted in the direction of travel in terms of where they want to go. And I think with the RO, to be honest, if you provide a very strong economic signal through the RO in terms of technologies, then, and maybe solar PV isn't a great example, but if you take solar PV when the tariff was originally established, clearly the tariff on solar PV was overly generous. And what we had essentially was, a bit of a Monte Carlo start. Okay, everybody rushing to do PV. The tariff was then recalibrated, and then we had a more sensible approach. Now, clearly, what you'd expect to see over time is a tapering, a recalibration of tariff in relation to cost for different technologies. The market should not expect to make, excessive returns on technology over time. But at the same time, to get inward investment, you need to be telling investors what they're likely to get if they commit long-term equity or long-term debt into a market.
Anyone else like to express a view on the respective appetites of Scottish Government and Westminster in terms of creating regulatory certainty? Some of you might not.
It's rather a lot of public sector.
I mean, my own particular area is, I guess, less affected by sort of issues such as EMR, but I think some of the same principles apply, that if we're going to get money into the energy efficiency market, we've got to create project structures and income structures where there is clarity of that income stream alongside clarity of capital costs. And that's part of the sort of the initial challenge in the energy efficiency world, is actually shaping those project opportunities and contractual structures to achieve that.
Absolutely.
The other thing I would say is that, I agree with Richard said, but you have to be careful that, and I'm not very politically correct generally, so let me not start now. But, it's for politicians, it's nice. The First Minister makes, obviously all the statements he makes, and so does Westminster. But at the end of the day, for an investor, once it's on a piece of paper, and we know how it actually looks like, then only then you have the comfort of actually making that investment. And that's where the big issue lies. In the US, same thing. Obama made a lot of statements, but unfortunately he couldn't quite fulfill them. And God knows what happens after November 6th. So, and then immediately, and that's what you see, there's a lot of capital sitting in a lot of companies who simply do not invest. And the same thing with Mazda or Mubadala Group, does not invest because we do not know where the market actually is heading. And that's the key issue. And like you said, the pivotal point, it's definitely there. If that is being sorted, and that is a piece of paper, and on you assume that there's no negation going on, then you will make an investment.
Yes. So legislative and contractual certainty is where investment decisions are made.
You're a lawyer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Andy, did you want to add something?
No, I think I would agree with those points. There is a very, very positive, obviously, sense that Scotland is hugely committed and our government is hugely committed to the targets that we are pursuing and to the policies that we're pursuing. But the rest of my fellow panelists are absolutely right. At the end of the day, clarity of policy is what will allow investment decisions to be made. And that is something that concerns all of us, something that we're all pushing hard to make sure we have as quickly as possible. And recognising the realities that there are competing demands on funds, competing demands on policy as well, but trying to maintain a very clear message. And I think it is what perhaps does set Scotland apart slightly is that absolute clarity of message remains, but it does need the policy to go with. I think it is a current challenge without a doubt. I think it will make tomorrow quite interesting.
Yes, yes. Well, we'll open up questions to the floor. Does anyone have a question they'd like to put to any of our panellists? I'll just get a microphone across to you. If you could just introduce yourself and the organisation you're from, please.
Hi, it's Jamie Robinson from the Scottish European Green Energy Centre. I just had a couple of questions actually for Charles. First of all, are there going to be any maximum or minimum kind of project values that the GIB will actually support? And secondly, you mentioned public sector organisations as having a leading role to play. How will the rates that the GIB offers compare to PWLB, for example? And
Okay.
the other kind of favourable rates that are already available
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the public sector?
I guess maximum minimum project sizes, we're going to have to operate as a wholesale funding institution. I mean, the total staffing of the GIB is not expected to be more than the order of 100 people. We've got 3 billion of capital to deploy over now 2.5 years. So we're going to have to invest in slugs of a reasonable size. We've been through a process, appointed 4 fund managers in the waste, 2 in the waste and 2 in the energy efficiency sectors, and their mandate is very much to invest in projects of under £30 million. So we recognise for smaller deal sizes of sub 30 million, then a sort of a partnering approach with others who can go out and help break bulk for us in the market is critical. In terms of maximum project size, clearly in the offshore market, very large projects, we will have a sort of a maximum single investment limitation within the portfolio. But it will be sufficient to be able to provide us meaningful support for the projects of the order of magnitude in offshore wind. In terms of the returns that we're going to need to generate, I mean, we are not in the business of competing sort of directly with sort of PWB or providing subsidised low-cost funding into the market. We've got to be about investing alongside private capital, bringing private capital in on the returns that the market would expect for the risks associated with the projects in question. So I guess in terms of what pricing we would charge, we would see ourselves as effectively being a sort of price taker rather than a price maker. Our role is not to drive the cost of private sector capital down. It's about working with the market to catalyse and to encourage private sector investors to come in at the market rate of the appropriate funding. Clearly, there's a role for us to try and encourage an efficient market, because in an inefficient market, then the capital price gets priced at effectively an uncompetitive level. But the key is that we're investing and bringing in capital on a market rate of return. And I guess in terms of our recycling thinking, we're always going to be thinking about, well, if we invest today, in a long-term project, we may not want to be holders until maturity. So what's going to be our ability to recycle that capital by refinancing it, and we're going to want to be able to refinance that at least at par, if not at generating some of our return from yield compression as those respective markets mature.
Richard,
all I wanted to add was, from a sort of commercial sort of funding standpoint, I mean, I think it was touched upon in the presentations this morning. I mean, clearly Basel III is having an impact on on the way that the banks introduce debt into the market. I think we have seen a sort of compression in relation to maturity over the last couple of years. I think Susan did mention that renewables, onshore wind in particular, and offshore wind coming through, I think, are asset classes that the banks are getting very familiar with. My sense is that there is an element of necessity being the mother of invention with the big banks, because I think what we are finding is that if Basel III is pushing us in a particular direction, then we will find structures that will enable these projects to get funded either through slightly shorter maturities, the involvement of the capital markets and institutional investors to come into these deals to allow us and the equity the equity investors to churn their positions so that we can free up headroom and do more. So I think, you know, working alongside, you know, GI in funding key UK infrastructure is absolutely what we're about. And I think we've come out, our chief executive has come out and said that, you know, the bank is looking to invest $1 billion over the next 12 months in UK infrastructure. And certainly, you know, the run rate of what we're doing at the moment, if you take the view that last year was an incredibly strong year for UK renewables, what we're seeing at the moment is that run rate is not that far off.
Any more questions?
Hi, good morning. Bob Downs, non-exec with the Environment Agency in Scotland. I just wanted to contrast, because the thing is about Scotland's role in the global low-carbon market. What have we learned from the offshore oil and gas industry? I remember at the height being quoted that it was the expenditure, the equivalent of a Channel tunnel every year when it was at its height, which was fantastic, great achievement. But I think the real key has got to be something around the capability on tradable capacity, on intellectual property, on technology. So I'm wondering, how is Scotland addressing what kind of content and tradable capability proponents of this big market is going to come from here, whether that's inward investment or generated locally?
A very good question. Andy, do you want to take that first?
I'll certainly take that. Thanks, Bob. It is a very, very important and very, very valid question. A lot of what's happening just now has been trying to grasp the scale of the opportunity, understand how big it is, how quickly is it going to come to fruition. I think, and Ronnie touched on it earlier on, one of the challenges that we're now trying to get eased into to everyone's understanding is, whilst there's a lot of opportunity coming around Scotland, there's already a lot going on in the rest of the UK and elsewhere in the world and in other areas. And a lot of the expertise we've got here is very exportable, particularly in the physical infrastructure work that people from 40 years experience in oil and gas have, and in the intellectual property they have. And we're seeing companies moving from focusing solely on oil and gas to extending their expertise out into renewables as well, and trading that internationally. And clearly, many of those are companies who have traded globally for many, many years. They're in some of the most challenging environments in the world and have learned the most extraordinary sets of skills. But in some of the technical support as well, in terms of the engineering development, even the legal and the surveying work that needs to be done around developing some of these projects, there's a huge amount of opportunity. And I think it's a great chance for us to grasp some of those companies, as we're starting to do now. And so, as well as developing an understanding of how you might move into this space here, there's clearly an enormous international market where we've got skills that we could export now and be the first ones into those markets. And some of those markets may not be markets that traditionally some of those companies have been in. Lena mentioned this morning that, you know, emerging markets such as Brazil and parts of Africa. Again, we've got an in there on the back of the oil and gas sector and some of the work that they've done. But there's a massive other things that can be done around environment. And Bob, your own organisation has been doing a lot on some of the legislation and climate activities, and some of the stuff around water, for example, where we collectively been working with Scottish Water on some of the international opportunities. There's a host of stuff that we can do. You know, our universities are connected fantastically across the world. And a lot of the research projects that are happening here, if you go into Strathclyde University and places like that, the derivers of those work are in all manner of different parts of the world. There's some fantastic expertise which is already being exported, and it's a critical part of the Scottish opportunity in global low carbon to make sure that we exploit and develop that further, and take it into all manner of new markets.
I mean, speaking from a green investment bank perspective, and my own area, the challenge is the market that I'm working in doesn't really exist to any great extent at the moment. So there's an opportunity, if we can crack it and we can create the models and the examples, that will require expertise. And I think there's an opportunity within Scotland, I guess with the environment and I guess the way sort of institutions work within Scotland, to make real progress in Scotland. If we manage to do that, clearly we're going to end up building up resource within Scotland, and that is expertise that across the UK and across Europe, people are desperately sort of trying to develop. In our discussions with the EIB, the European Commission is desperately trying to sort of achieve investment in energy efficiency across Europe. But actually, not a lot of progress has been made. I think the model in the UK is going to be different from, I guess, the approach in Germany has been, sort of low cost, cheap KfW money, catalysing the market. I think we all recognise that, across Europe and the Western world, we live in a world where there is, ever more constrained public sector funding. So what we've got to try and do is to sort of catalyse a market that can operate on commercial terms with commercial funding to get away from the constraints of public funding on the speed of its deployment.
Ronnie.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point about wave and tidal. We've been focusing on offshore wind just now. As far as wave and tidal is concerned, Scotland's the world leader. We've got the world's biggest offshore wave and tidal projects in the world. The Pentland Firth and Orkney Waters scheme alone amounts to 1.7 gigawatts, and that's in addition to the offshore wind offering. And that's an area where no one else in the world is anywhere near that, and that's all within Scotland.
And a slightly, maybe slightly oblique but related point, I think the work that's happening around the UK and particularly in relation to Scotland in terms of the involvement of local communities in the fabric of these projects, I think is absolutely key. I think I was fortunate, privileged in many ways to be involved in the opening of an onshore wind scheme a few weeks ago on the outskirts of Glasgow called Miller Hill. And I think what was fantastic about that was you essentially had, the local scout group, the local school, local landowners, local members of the community, all coming out to celebrate effectively, the opening of something that was going to contribute economically to the local community. And again, the interesting thing about that particular deal in relation to the sort of technology dynamic was the use for the first time of, Siemens Direct Drive technology in the UK, which we were very pleased to fund. So I think in terms of the community benefit, and this picks up on, I think, some of Charles's work on the energy efficiency side with the involvement of local authorities in Green Deal. Again, that is pretty revolutionary stuff, which I think needs to be encouraged.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hello, Paul Adderley, Sustainable Opportunity Solutions. I'd like to pick up a point that Susan mentioned in her presentation around the costing between renewables is seen as total cost, whereas fossil fuels or high carbon projects don't take into account the cost of the externalities. And if there was better pricing for high carbon projects or fossil fuels compared to new renewables, would there be a need for a government subsidy to attract investment? Is that pricing model causing a barrier? I don't know the details of the energy market reform, so it may be in there, but that's one.
Ron, you picked up earlier the point on subsidies and the reliance on subsidies being an unattractive feature for investment.
Yes. No, it's an interesting point which Mazda has been dealing with also in the Middle East, where hydrocarbons are priced slightly different than everywhere else in the world. And we've more than once have tried to make the case saying that if you take the real market value of these electricity prices into consideration, would not require that there would not be such a delta between the subsidy. In this case, I try to be political sensitive because I live there. So let's say that the discussion didn't go very far for all kind of reasons. I also think that what you find worldwide is that I think generally electricity prices are, at least in the developed world, are very much priced according to whatever the market price is for that particular hydrocarbon product. So that at the end of the day, as long as if that is a real market value and the renewable energy is the real market value, if there is a delta, there is a delta. And if you then would add the carbon price to it, we all know where the CERs and the VERs actually went. They went nowhere. And that caused then subsequently that if that's the real price for carbon, then you basically still require a subsidy. What is an interesting, and I think Al Gore said this more than once, how much value do you put on future climate degradation, I think he called it. How much value do you put on that one to actually say whether that really the hydrocarbon-based power is actually really that price is actually a real price, or whether you take, like I said earlier this morning, you take the future of that into consideration. But I find it a very complicated debate, which I don't think so far anybody has really been able to solve. So yes, if you really price climate damage, 20 years from now, God knows how you calculate that. But if you calculate that and put it into a carbon price, you'd get somewhere. But the CDM and the other ones, like I said, clearly tried to put a price on carbon, didn't really work well, not to date.
Yeah, I think it's an obvious point to make, but I think generally speaking, the market has to be designed to accommodate both. The reality is you cannot weight a market with an overt amount of intermittent generation without having backup supplies to take up the slack when demand is high and wind in this case is low. So I think you have to try to accommodate a market where you have baseload capacity and clearly, if conversion on a biomass basis or dedicated biomass schemes come through, they can be designed to run at base load. But I think the reality is that, thermal plant and or higher carbon plant and renewables have to coexist on a complementary basis to make the market work.
Yeah, if I could just add that we shouldn't forget that there's already a roadmap and a route map, and if you go to the Crown Estate stand, you'll see a brochure on pathways to bring down the levelised cost of energy for offshore wind so that it's comparable and comparative to the hydrocarbon side. There's a recognition just now that offshore wind in particular is by comparison expensive. However, there's a way being identified and there's no silver bullet. There's a number of different things that have to be taken into account and things that have to click into place with finance, cost of finance, innovation, and then the supply chain and the manufacturing side. Those costs are projected to come down within the next period, within the next 10 years, and that the aim there is to get a levelised cost of energy akin to £100 per megawatt hour.
It's worth noting that EMR does try and do a little bit of both by giving particular subsidies to particular technology types through the contract for difference mechanic, but also to put a carbon price floor support mechanic in place as well that increases the generating costs associated with high carbon intensive generation, which should make non-carbon intensive generation more economic in itself and raise the overall wholesale price. So it's trying to do a little bit of both in EMR. I think we've got time for one more question, and there was one over here.
Steve Henry, Wells College. I think you can't have all your eggs in one basket, so you need different technologies to provide. You can think back historically when we built Inverkirk Power Station, which we never really utilised. That was for backup. You talk about the peaks and troughs. So that's something that needs managed, and we certainly need, the green energy. And I think folk will pay a bit more, knowing that that's the future, rather than saying everything we've got now, there's nothing left. And I think the key point about the community being involved in the wind farm, I think is very good, because I can think back in the power station when they built it, and they had a threat protesting against building it on our lovely beaches. So you'll always get pros and you'll always get cons.
Yeah. And I think that's a fantastic point. I mean, I think the reality is you have to bring the general public, the voting public with you, because I think particularly when we have, the austerity agenda that we have now, clearly costs are very, very important. Taking costs out of technologies, taking costs out of the system to provide the most effective and cost-effective form of generation is absolutely key. But I think what goes hand in that is an embedded need for growth. I think frankly, if you are looking at a way of smearing growth over a generation, there are different ways of doing it. One way is to reform a market, and allow and incentivise investment to come through. But I think bringing the community with you and educating the community around the pros and cons and the benefits is absolutely key. Because if you take nuclear, for example, in the UK, my sense is that the communities that welcomed new generation, nuclear in its original incarnation into the UK are advocates of nuclear on those existing sites. And I think in the same way that with renewables, bringing the public with you and the community with you and understanding the nature of the technology and the fact that the UK is an island which has security of supply issues, diversity of supply issues, and the price of energy is probably only headed in one direction is key.
Absolutely. Lady, you heard a question. Yep.
I'm Claire Bourne. I work for the UK Youth Climate Coalition, amongst other things. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. So most of what we've discussed today has been along the lines of the politics and legislation needed for a stable market. But what I'm interested to hear from you, and Richard began to touch on it slightly before, is how important you think it is that we have a Scottish society, be that trained up young people, which is obviously something I'm particularly interested in, be that community commitment, that are ready to support a renewables market and to create a stability within that for investment. How important is that, and what does that look like? What sort of community do you need for that?
You're absolutely right, and let me say at the outset is that if we don't take this up and we don't educate our young people and bring them on to do this, then other countries will. And these projects will still be built, but they just won't be built using our homegrown talent, as it were. So I think if we want to grasp this and we want to maximise the benefit, it's certainly something we need to do. But don't get me wrong, other people and other jurisdictions will find the people to do it if we don't.
Yeah, I completely agree with the point that you've made. I think just to give a very brief example, we co-sponsored an offshore wind supply chain event 2 or 3 years ago up near Newcastle with NAREC, and I think the sense that we got at the time was that there would be moderate interest locally in that event, but the conference facility that they had, you had people standing 5 deep at the back. All the seats were full, 5 deep at the back, and these were SME companies hugely interested in the supply chain. And then if you multiply that by potential apprenticeships that hang off the supply chain in offshore wind, clearly it's an enormous opportunity. But the counter is to make sure that the regulation that you put in place will provide this generational opportunity, because PV, when PV was set in motion in the UK, what we saw across the UK was lots of small companies setting up PV-related installation businesses, men in white vans, as I think they were called in the press, looking to get involved in that market. And all of a sudden, that comfort blanket of regulation was pulled. The fit was tapered. So I think in relation to small businesses for supply chain opportunities and all the rest of it, it's a fantastic opportunity if the regulation is there to encourage that build out of employment opportunities.
Charles?
One of the challenges with, the big challenge with energy efficiency, it's quite complicated. There are a whole host of barriers as to why people don't, carry out energy efficiency investment, even if they know it's the right thing to do. And so as we think about the interventions, we've got to sort of encourage people in place. One of the questions is, well, how do you get the push, from from the top to encourage the chief executive and the finance director to think about making the investment that the asset manager probably has a pretty clear idea what he could do if he had the brief to do. And I think so mobilisation of the population, to put pressure on organisations to actually take this seriously is a really important part of getting investment in our sector. Whether that be universities and universities realising that actually their students care about it, and that's one of the criteria. Brand. So as I think about sort of the retail sector, where am I going to go and look to see how I can get a push? It's organisations where green is part of the brand, where they're going to get it first. So I think there's a really important part of actually mobilising the whole community here, and then the sort of virtuous circle here is that investment. And the beauty of energy efficiency is it should, much of it should pay for itself. So this is probably if we can make it work, this is the lowest cost way of greening our economy, making our economy more efficient, but also growing it through increased investment. So there is this virtuous circle that we've got to try and create, and starting with the push from the community is a really important part of it.
Anyone else want to pick up on that?
I can only say, although it's slightly different, but probably you don't know, but Masdar has, we always run this World Future Energy Summit in January. We have the Zegezayed Energy Prize. It used to be just for big companies handing out $2 million for the prize. But this year we have a special category to stimulate schools to be involved in renewable energy. So I believe it's like $100,000 prize for a school worldwide who can basically, come up with a project which is obviously, supports sustainability. And the reason that is done, because I think it's very simple, right? I mean, renewable energy is a major shift, climate change is a major happening, and if you don't do this with basic support throughout the society, including, it's if the kids are involved now, they will be, realize later, how this is actually all that it needs to be done, and they will benefit from it. So, sorry about the word kids. I think it would be the young adults, right, or something. But I think you get the drift.
I think there's a fantastic opportunity in some of this. I've been involved in some really interesting conversations recently about some of the things that we're trying to develop around retrofitting technology to some of the buildings in Scotland. If you look at some of our cities, you're not going to be building lots of new housing, but we've got housing associations looking to fit more efficient technologies to some of their existing housing stock. Many of them, if they do so, will address some of the social issues of the quality of the housing, the lifestyle qualities in some of our cities, and a great opportunity and an interest in some companies in using those as pilot projects and extending that out to also then providing opportunities to train and develop the skill sets of young people within the community to learn about the technologies and learn about the practical skills of how you actually install these technologies. So give them some skills, give them some employment training actually in their own local area. So not only are they becoming skilled and hopefully employable, but they're also at the same time improving the quality of their own environment. So there's a real prize for them there as well in terms of both the social as well as the commercial reality of the opportunities.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll have to wrap up there. We're out of time. I hope you found it to be an interesting discussion. I certainly have. I've taken away a few kind of key messages from this. As ever in this debate, stability is the most important issue. That's the number one thing. Supportive politics are helpful, but legislative certainty is the real decision maker, and that's what's necessary for unlocking investment. A scale of opportunity is certainly here in Scotland. There's a massive opportunity. There's plenty of scope for capital investment. But we in Scotland need to do something to help meet the challenge. We need to be proactive in demonstrating our support for the sector, encouraging politicians to sort out the problems, and also in creating a good pipeline of good quality projects to take to the international investment community to invest in. And if we can do all of that, there's a real future for the youth of Scotland to be involved in this industry for generations to come. So if you would join me in thanking our panel for their contributions today, I would be very grateful. Thank you. And I believe lunch will now be served in the area where coffee was served earlier. So have a nice lunch.